We would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which the university stands. We respectfully recognise elders past and present. On the eve of a historic referendum, we welcome you to an evening of thought-provoking discussion about the Indigenous voice to Parliament here at the RMIT Media Precinct. Tomorrow, Australians will head to the polls to vote yes or no on whether to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. I'm Ruth McHugh-Dillon. I grew up on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people whose land I live on today. I also pay my respects to any First Nations people who've joined us today, and especially Grant and Charles, thank you.
And I'm Maddie Lowe Booth. I grew up on the country of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the people whose land we gathered on here today, and I do pay my respects to the traditional owners and extend my respect and thanks to our panellists who are joined here today. And I'd like to have a really warm welcome for Charles Pakana, Grant Hansen, and Edwin Jeffrey. Thank you very much for joining us here today. We're very, very lucky to be joined by three people with experience producing news about the referendum as well as analysing its coverage. And they will generously be sharing that experience with us today.
So Charles, we'll start with you. You're an Aboriginal man and the owner and founder of Victorian Aboriginal News. Journalism is a family affair. Your father was a journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald, and your eldest daughter Rana, is now the head of NITV Referendum Unit. In your own podcast series, which I recommend to everyone, the Referendum 23 tapes, you've provided a platform for a really incredible array of Indigenous community members, elders, journalists, representatives from Aboriginal corporations. We'd love to start by hearing what has that experience been like and how has it impacted your understanding of the referendum campaign and how it's played out?
Well, I think, first of all, from a personal perspective, it's given me a depth of understanding that I would not have otherwise gained. The opportunity to speak to people from both sides of the camp. We interviewed David Littleproud, the leader of the National Party, of course, to get that particular side. But to speak to people like Auntie Jill Gallagher from VATCHO, who used to be our Treaty Commissioner, to Janine Mohammed, who's the CEO and adjunct professor at the Lowachuck Institute, who've done extensive work in these things. Of course, Thomas Mayo and others. And not all Aboriginal people. Cheryl Saunders, who I believe is going to be on here later, to get the constitutional perspective. For me, it's been a learning experience, and every single episode that we've done over the course of the past 10 months has been a learning experience for me. And that's what we wanted to provide to the community as well, rather than a very single agenda or narrow agenda approach, as we've seen from certain media. I wanted to provide something broad and almost random in its approach.
Yeah.
But I think that approach has actually given us something that no other media outlet has done.
Thanks, Charles. We'll get back to talking about that a bit more
Sure.
very soon. I'd like to continue introducing the rest of the panel. So also joining us today is Edwin Jeffrey. So this is a once-in-a-lifetime referendum, and I assume it's the first referendum you'll be voting in?
Yes.
Amid all the information and misinformation that's circulated, you've had a very particular position working as a researcher at RMIT. So we'd love to know a bit more about what it's been like working closely on the referendum campaigns in your work as a fact checker. Were you surprised by the work that you were doing?
Well, I suppose I started doing this sort of work just before the federal election last year. So that was my introduction into online misinformation, what it is, how it acts, etc. But the referendum really has been a completely different ballgame to the election. So going in, I had a couple of expectations around, okay, well, I expected first off a lot of racism and racism intermingled and playing with misinformation online. But then also had this expectation that we were going to see a lot of old, long-standing and debunked claims. So for example, the same sort of claims that we saw around native title, I expected would rear their ugly head.
And we will, sorry to cut you off, Ivan, we'll go into some of that misinformation more. We're really interested in that. But I'd like to introduce Grant Hansen. So you're a Tongarong man and you've worked as a broadcaster in radio and TV for more than 30 years. And you're currently chairperson of the First Nations Media Association, which is the national peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander media in Australia. You also work for 3 Cool and Deadly, which is Melbourne's first and only Indigenous owned and managed radio station. So you're really embedded in that community perspective. So we'd love to hear from you. How has that position as a broadcaster shaped your understanding of the referendum?
Look, I think it's a pretty straightforward thing. It's an advisory body to government. I think that my role was just to explain the simplicity of what it actually is and not overcomplicate it, because as we were just speaking about, we're seeing a lot of untruths, a lot of lies being told, a lot of people talking a lot of crap, basically. So my job was to dispel all that type of stuff and just keep the perspective of what the advisory body was. You know, just a body that give advice to government. It has no veto. And I just tried to simplify it so that people could understand it very basically, and that's what it is.
Yeah, great. Let's join again, a warm round of applause for our guests.
So we're going to head into our first segment now. Tonight is the eve of the referendum. Voters are going to head to the polls tomorrow. The last few weeks and months have been dominated by referendum coverage. Here's a quick summary of how we got here, produced by RMIT students Freddie Moffat, Zach A. Sparks and Taylor Sadgrove.
First movements on Indigenous recognition was started in the late 1930s by William Cooper, but really gained traction in 1967, when over 90% of Australians voted to include the Indigenous population in census data, allowing for essential laws to be made for Indigenous people. Then came Mabo in 1992, whose native title lawsuit led to the High Court recommending constitutional recognition. However, this never came to be.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, we say sorry.
After Kevin Rudd apologised in 2008, Julia Gillard would form an expert panel 2 years later to advise on constitutional recognition. Their recommendations would form the basis of 2015's Kirribilli Statement, written by Indigenous leaders. This led to the establishment of the Referendum Council, which conducted local dialogues from the end of 2016 until days before the First Nations Constitutional Convention in 2017. The 4-day event hosted over 250 Indigenous representatives who wrote the Uluru Statement from the Heart, advocating for truth-telling, treaty, and a voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution. In May 2022, an Indigenous-led ad campaign called for the voice to Parliament to become an issue in the upcoming election, which was rejected by then Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Anthony Albanese's Labor Party went on to win the election later that month and pledged to hold a referendum by the end of 2023.
A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve?
He proposed the referendum question in March, and a few weeks later, Peter Dutton announced the Liberals would officially oppose the voice. At the end of May, the House of Representatives passed the referendum bill, with the Senate following a few weeks later, confirming we'd be heading to the polls. So, when would that be?
Today I announce that referendum day will be the 14th of October.
So that was the official start of the campaign, but in some ways the campaign really had already started back in May 2022 when Anthony Albanese won the election and made the announcement on that night that he would commit to the Uluru Statement in full. And that was such a simple, powerful moment, powerfully worded, but it's obviously become a lot more complicated since that night. So what we want to ask the panel is, how do you think the length of that campaign and kind of sustaining that unofficial campaign has impacted the way people have engaged with the issue itself? So maybe, Charles, could we start with you?
I think the campaign itself, as you said, started a fair bit earlier. than the Prime Minister's announcement. From my standing, it really started years and years ago. But if we were to talk about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, then really in my mind it started in 2017 when that document was actually written and signed by the 250 delegates. And I remember speaking soon afterwards to Thomas Mayo, who was charged by the delegates of the Uluru Statement and the signatories to carry that document around Australia and bear that honour to promote the message, that very humble and unity message across Australia. The campaign itself, though, I think, look, it played into the hand of the no campaigns, there's no doubt. Grant had some great things to say about this in the green room beforehand, and I'm definitely not going to steal his thunder. But I will say that if it had been shorter, we might be looking at a different look in the polls right now. I would like it to have been shorter, would have been less cycle of disinformation and subsequent misinformation.
I think we'll head to a live explainer on the polls, since you've kind of brought that up already, and then I'm really keen to hear what Grant was saying in the green room. So the polls are one of the ways that we track public sentiment, but so Edmund Coleman and Neve Sutton are going to explain how the polls have looked throughout the year.
Cheers, Maddie and Ruth. I'm Edmund Coleman.
And I'm Neve Sutton. We'll be taking you through the polls, tracking the big moments in the campaign, and taking a look at where the polls currently sit.
Just behind us is the tale of two polls. News poll, yellow, conducted for the Australian, and Resolve, purple, conducted for the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald.
When Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced the wording of the question in March, there was a strong support for the yes vote. This is also when the wording became settled, and pollsters were able to ask people the very same question that will be put to them in the polling booth. Opposition leader Peter Dutton's announcement in April said that the Liberals will be taking an official no stance, which triggered a dramatic drop in the polls.
In June, Indigenous Federal Senator Lydia Thorpe announced she would be actively campaigning for the no vote, marking the convergence of the Conservative no and the Progressive no. The next wave of polls saw support for yes slip below 50% nationally. When the date of the referendum was announced in August, the Resolve poll sat at 46% and News poll at 42%.
To pass, the referendum requires a majority yes vote nationwide and in at least 4 states. According to the latest Resolve poll, New South Wales is sitting at 48% yes and Victoria is at 46%. South Australia is at 44% and Tasmania at 56% for the yes vote. Western Australia and Queensland are behind at 39% and 36%.
So today, where's the referendum at? For the yes campaign to win, it would have to mean a fairly massive error in the polling, 3 times larger than that of the 2019 election. That again was Scott Morrison's so-called miracle win against the widely favoured Bill Shorten. But it has to be said that referendum polls differ from election polls. In referendums, voters are traditionally less influenced by entrenched political persuasions. And in a country known for its yeah-nahs and nah-yes, many Australians are still unsure of how they'll vote. Across the nation, between 7 and 14% of the population still remain undecided. That's certainly enough to swing the result. The question is, will it?
That's all from us. I'm Neve Sutton. And
I'm Edmund Coleman. Back to you, Maddie and Ruth.
Thanks, Edmund and Neve. So let's bring it back to the panel. Grant, you have some pretty, from what I'm guessing, based on what we've said before, you have some ideas about the length of the referendum and how polling has kind of worked alongside that.
I mean, I'd have to ask anybody really how accurate the polls are. I don't know any Aboriginal people have been asked who they're voting for. The polls are reflective of certain suburbs that will have a certain standing about the voice, whether it's a yes or no vote, and trying to talk to Aboriginal people about what they're going to be voting. So they're misleading. I think polls you could take with a grain of salt, really. So I'm not really that interested in what the polls say at the moment. I think the voting on Saturday will tell the story.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that as well, the kind of polling that has been done of Aboriginal perspectives, but with this stat about 80% of Indigenous people supporting the yes. We are going to throw to a break. It's TV. So we'll be back after the break to talk a bit more about civic literacy and the educational materials that have been available during the campaign. Thanks.
Welcome back to the program. So far, just before the break, we were talking about the journey to the referendum, and we only just got started talking about that. But we're going to move the conversation on, hopefully get back to some of those key points. But I want to move the conversation towards a discussion on how civic responsibility and civic processes have been communicated to the public. So to get things started, we're going to hear from Professor Cheryl Saunders. She's a member of the Constitutional Expert Group who provided legal support to the Referendum Working Group. Penry Buckley spoke to her last week at the University of Melbourne. Here's what she had to say.
We had been discussing for over a decade what constitutional recognition would look like. It was a policy put forward by both sides of politics. There were about 5 different possibilities on the table, been discussed by committee after committee. None of them was agreed, not because they were controversial, they just didn't seem to hit the mark. And it really wasn't until the Referendum Council in 2016, I think, said, let's put in place a process whereby the Indigenous people themselves are asked, what does it look like in a way that actually means something to you? And the idea of the voice came out of that. And it's an interesting idea because it is symbolic, clearly, but it is also practical. It does something. All the sections in the Constitution do something. The Australian Constitution is our most basic law that sets out the framework for the system of government. And for that reason, it can only be changed by a special way, which involves a referendum in which we all vote. We look for 2 sets of majorities. One, we look to see whether there's an overall majority, whether Australians voting nationally have approved the proposal. And secondly, we look for majorities in a majority of states. My own experience is that people have found it very useful just to be introduced to the words of the change, to be taken through them, to be given the opportunity to ask any questions they have, and to see for themselves. And it will do two things. One, it will literally achieve recognition. The opening words of the proposed change begin with recognising the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. And then the rest of the section goes on to establish what it calls a voice, which is a body, an advisory body representing Indigenous people, and saying what the voice will do. It can make representations. The representations are made to the government and parliament, and the representations are about matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
So we've just heard from Professor Cheryl Saunders from the Melbourne Law School break down the how and the why of the voice to Parliament pretty clearly and concisely, but I think it hasn't always been communicated so effectively during the campaign. We're interested to ask the panel about the kind of materials that have been available to educate people about a referendum. But Grant, I'd like to come back to you as well, because you said, or you alluded to the idea that maybe certain things about how the campaign has played out, the length or maybe the lack of information, has fed into ways yes and no have played out. Did you want to speak to that?
Well, I thought the No campaign came out very early. They had a good 3 or 4 month window there to get a lot of topics out there regarding this campaign, and a lot of it was untruths. It was divisive. They were talking about it being a divisive document, and they actually were probably single-handedly, with the help of a couple of Aboriginal people, in causing that division in this country. The 1967 referendum gave the Indigenous people the right to vote, but didn't give us recognition in the Constitution. Maybe that should have happened in 1967. So here we are, some 50 years later, talking about it again. I think the education with non-Indigenous people in this country is still at a very minimum. Some of the comments that I've read over these last few months have been horrific, very racist. There's a lot of bigots out there. And to think that we're asking 97% of the population to vote in favour of a referendum for Indigenous people, that they really don't understand what it's about. So tomorrow, a lot of non-Indigenous people wake up and just continue with their life and their day. But 3,000 homeless people in Darwin tomorrow might be better off if the Yes campaign gets up. And that's what it's about, really, is about making a difference. We talk about equality. The whole reason for having a voice is to bring about equality and to make things better for Indigenous people, because the system hasn't worked for many decades. And that's what this voice is about, is bringing equality, because we're not equal in this country. And people think all of a sudden that they know everything about Aboriginal affairs. They don't. And all these untruths have been really disappointing and as I say, untruthful, particularly the No campaign, and they've got a lot to answer for.
I'd like to then open it up a little bit to think about what kind of information has been available, because you're saying that there are some things that are not true or may be true or not communicated effectively. Idwin and Charles, do you have an opinion on that, on how well people have been educated about the civic process and the referendum itself?
Well, I will say that, as I said, with my expectations going in, I thought there was going to be a lot of misconceptions, racial misconceptions. What I didn't realise is that public literacy around the electoral process was so low. So we really had to delve into the minutiae of the Constitution, of the referendum process, of the referendum question itself, and we had to go to experts and really dig into these really microscopic details, because unfortunately it was these details that were blurred early on in the campaign or misunderstood, misinterpreted, and those then grew legs over the duration of the campaign, or the lead up, I should say, the months and months lead up to the referendum, to create much larger claims and misinformation and disinformation. So yeah, I would say that was that transformation almost, which stems from a lack of public understanding of what the referendum process looks like, what the Constitution looks like.
I think another thing, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, Charles, afterwards, is, I guess, why we needed to have a referendum, the idea that constitutional recognition was one of the things that had been asked for in the Uluru Statement. There's narratives going around about why can't we legislate this? This is that, which is a different thing. And do you think that plays into this idea of civic literacy in terms of does the public know how these processes work? Do they understand the differences between these two things and how they carry different meanings? Charles?
You're talking about a number of different things there, and I just want to pick up on one of the key things that have been lacking, and that's just general understanding of what's actually up for a vote. Those 92 words that are going to represent Section 129, Chapter 9 of the Constitution. Every time I do a presentation to community about this, we break down those 92 words, and every time I will ask people, where is the power that's being given to the Aboriginal people? In a matter of fact, Noel Pearson came out and has said on a number of times, this is such an innocent ask. I'm paraphrasing there a bit, but even he recognised there is no power being given to Aboriginal people through this proposed change to the Constitution. Once people understand that, a lot of their fears about losing their land to the United Nations, about having to pay to live in Australia, all of a sudden, those fears disappear. The other bit of information that I think has really been frustrating me, or a bit of information that hasn't been getting out to community, is the fact that around about the same time that Peter Dutton stood up in Parliament and started saying, where's the information, where's the information? Within a couple of days, I think, Anthony Albanese was standing up at a press conference and saying, holding up a bit of paper saying, well, here are the design principles. The design principles that have been developed by the Referendum Working Group, which outline very, very broad brushstrokes. This is how we envisage the voice will look, how it will be elected. Now, this was all based on the Calma-Langton report, which is an extensive report, which has been out there for ages. These are the bits of information which have not been getting out to the community. The community is still running scared from conservative media regurgitated rhetoric.
Yeah.
And that's a real concern.
And we're going to head in our next section to kind of pick up on that misinformation and how it's, it can kind of run free. Idwan, you've obviously worked a lot with that. We're heading to another break now, but stay with us to look at misinformation. Welcome back. You're with us live at the Media Precinct at RMIT University, and we're joined by the fabulous panel here, Charles Picana, Grant Hansen and Idwin Jeffrey. So we're going to get really stuck into an issue that has been so important during this campaign, which is the management of misinformation and disinformation. To start off, we have a clip here from Dr. Anne Kruger, who's the director of RMIT Crosscheck, and she's going to give us some insight into her work, what it actually looks like to combat misinformation.
We knew even before the campaign started for The Voice that there are particular sort of hotspot topics or potential areas that were going to be problematic. And unfortunately, these are things that have just carried on through history. There's certain tropes, racist tropes, and just even misunderstandings, when it comes to things like funding and, different programs and things like that. So we set about and did up a big, long list of pre-bunks beforehand and sent that out to the media partners that we have. We'll see things, we'll see certain narratives that are coming up, and we'll warn journalists. We'll say, look, this hasn't quite reached the tipping point that you might not want to do a whole story on this because you might amplify a voice that we don't think should be amplified, or, a certain ideological group, and we don't think their agenda is necessarily as honourable as what they might be saying at first. Or, it could be something that is actually, trying to divide people. And so we'll just give a bit of advice and just sort of say, look, we're seeing this, but it doesn't mean you necessarily do nothing. So you can actually start to write up some stories that are talking around the issues, but have that quality information there. And that's what we really encourage our reporters to do.
So, Idwin, you've been working as a fact checker at RMIT. I'm really keen to hear a bit more about what your work has involved. Some people might not know what fact checking actually is, or like what the process is. Could you tell us a bit more about what you did and what were some of the main narratives that you had to combat throughout the referendum campaign?
Yeah, sure. So I do think there is a lack of understanding about what we can actually check as fact checkers. So a claim has to be an explicit statement or assertion that something is the way it is. So the example I always use is the sky is red, right? That's not a question, that's not an opinion, that's not an implication, that's not a joke or a satirical, that's a statement. And this is what we're looking at. We're looking at public figures and online users who are making claims towards The Voice that just will be simply misleading. So once we identify a claim, we often ask ourselves, is this in the public interest for us to address it? And what the public harm is going to be if we don't address it. And I think that was a really key one for The Voice because, again, as I said, a lot of people don't understand referendums or what the Voice model actually looked like. So a big part of our thinking process was, if we don't address this, will this be valuable information that the voter needs in the ballot box, or confuse or misinform them? Once we've sort of looked at a claim and identified perhaps the kernel of truth and how it's been taken out of context or changed or made misleading, we sort of then explain that through our fact check. So we go, okay, here's, it's rarely binary, rarely fully true or fully false. It's sort of more, this has been cherry picked, or this has been, somehow changed or transformed to be misleading. So I think an example with The Voice, if someone gave a personal opinion and said, I think this will be a racist discriminatory policy, we wouldn't fact check that. However, we did fact check claims such as The Voice is an apartheid system, because that was something that we would be able to fact check, because we were able to look at the definition of an apartheid, able to look at the model of The Voice, and very clearly say, okay, we're talking about, apples and bicycles.
And so, Adwin, sorry, I'll just bring in some other panel members there. So, Charles, how effectively do you think those kind of statements and misinformation has been dealt with during this campaign, from your perspective?
I think the fact that the RMIT and ABC have done an amazing job, and so too has Australian Associated Press, the AAP. I think without those fact-checking services, we would be in a much more dire situation than we currently find ourselves. As I was mentioning to Idwin before, in my work, I was constantly going back to the RMIT ABC fact check and the AAP fact check, because you're just bombarded with so much information that you simply don't know. I remember waking up one morning thinking, so what am I actually going to vote? And just had to shake myself, think I've consumed so much negative media that I just needed to have that reality check. And I've constantly, every time I present, always urge people, look, we can't address all the fibs that are out there in our work, and I know Grant can't as well. But if you spread out to your communities, go back to RMIT ABC, go to the AAP, and you'll find simply the vast majority of those facts have either been denied or substantiated, but more the former.
Yeah. And so we've got a question actually from the audience, which goes to your point before, Grant, about, you know, which Aboriginal people have been polled, for example. So we'll come to Alex Wake in the audience. Are you there, Alex? Yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. One of the things I've been asked a lot as we've been talking about the voice is, how do we know that Indigenous people actually want it? And I had understood that they did. And that, in fact, that there was 80% of First Nations people were in support of the voice. But how do I know that that figure is correct and that there is general agreement among Indigenous people?
Yeah.
I think it's important to understand that Aboriginal people were from many different nations, and we're not unlike the wider Australian community. I mean, you've got more than one political party, you've got Labor, you've got Liberal, so we're no different. We are talking about probably 80% of Indigenous people. Consensus has always been the Aboriginal way, so we would go along with the 80%. Obviously, there's going to be some no campaigners as well, but that's their prerogative. But, you know, we're no different, and 80% is a pretty healthy number of people that are agreeing to the Yes campaign. The Yes campaign is not the one stop for everybody. The advisory board is not going to solve every Aboriginal issue. It's not meant to. Other stuff will happen, treaties and all that stuff will happen outside. This is just a small step on a journey going forward. So it's important to understand that, you know, it's not the one-stop shop that it's portrayed to be.
Yeah, and so that diversity of opinions is obviously really important. A brief answer maybe from Idwin. So I know as a fact check you've worked on that stat a little bit, the 80%. Yep. Where does that come from, going to Alex's question?
So the 80% stat comes from two polls conducted at the start of this year, an Ipsos poll conducted in January and a YouGov poll conducted in March. I have the exact stats with me in my notes, but quick question. Basically, the issues that we touched on before do come into the story. Polls are a moment in time, so it showed how people were likely to vote in January and March, and they're also sort of predictive. That being said, we did actually have experts analyse these two polls at the start of the year and say, yes, their methodologies were fair. There was some criticism at the time that their sample sizes were a bit small, especially the Ipsos, which after being weighted was about a sample size of about 181 people who identified themselves as Indigenous. So yeah, the experts did approve their methodology and said these are okay stats, but with any poll there are caveats and sort of important things to understand, that there's always going to be a margin of error, there's always going to be, yeah, these sort of details.
A live fact check from a fact checker. Thank you, Idwin Jeffrey. We're going to move to a break now, but we'll be back soon with more on community engagement and the Voice referendum. Thanks for joining us. So just before the break, we were chatting about misinformation and disinformation and the role of fact-checking and the media. Leading on from that, I'm wondering, how does misinformation affect different demographics? So here I'm thinking about people perhaps who don't have English as their first language, or people from different age groups, especially with misinformation happening online and spreading through social media as well. I'm just wondering, what work do you think has been done to engage and inform people with different needs and from different backgrounds? Perhaps, Grant, I'll head to you first.
Look, I think it's up to the individual to actually find out the facts and to study it, regardless of what race you are or how long you lived in the country. Some of the misinformation, like the renaming of Aboriginal suburbs. There already is suburbs in Melbourne, Moorabbin, Toorak, Nunawading, Tullamarine. They're all Aboriginal names anyway, so I don't know what people are so worried about changing suburbs for. So I think it really is. Look, I talk to people many times about what the advisory board was going to do in terms of Aboriginal people, and they just won't have it. So some people are just that ignorant and arrogant that they just won't have it. Doesn't matter how many times and how simple you put it to people, they just don't want to have the voice, and they've used this referendum platform to enforce their bigotry upon other people. And I think the onus is up to the individual. If you don't know something, you go and find out, regardless of what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that really also speaks very directly to one of the key messages of the No campaign, which was if you don't know, vote no, which was, yeah.
If you don't vote, if you don't know, go and find out.
Google it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder though also about communities, for example, who are citizens but English might not be their first language, including First Nations communities, especially remote communities. Has there been a lot of work done to communicate that? Do you think maybe Idwin at RMIT?
Yeah, sure, there has been. So what we sort of did is worked in a collaborative partnership with a lot of newsrooms to look at what's happening online, look at the misinformation that's spreading, and then communicate that to newsrooms directly. So we worked a lot with SBS, for example, who does have quite a broad language program. And that means we can say, okay, this is going on, and they can then give it to their communities in language at times. So for example, SBS has been hosting town halls in Taiwanese and Arabic, I believe, to spread the message to those who might not be getting it through English speaking channels. And yeah, we've really been working on creating that information flow, if you like, between the newsrooms.
And Charles, what do you think about that? Has it been effectively communicated, or has it kind of stayed in just mainstream media?
I think we've seen a fair bit of coverage. I'll just talk Victoria specifically. A lot of the local governments have actually taken it upon themselves to develop an educational program. Definitely we've done some work with Marybeck Council, Banyule Council, Nillumbik Council and a number of other councils around Melbourne to get out there and speak to staff, to speak to their communities. Now we've spoken to the Somali community in Heidelberg West, we've spoken to the Arabic community in Marybeck, and multicultural community in Marybeck. There has been a lot of these events going on. What's really surprised me though, excuse me, and disappointed me, is the really poor showing up of people. I've been to events where 2 people have turned up, even though they've been broadly broadcast, very few people turning up. And I'm going to take some water.
Yeah, well, thank you to everyone in our audience today for showing up. We appreciate it, in the aim to spread information, not misinformation. Was there anything you wanted to add, Charles, or give your...
The information has been out there. I quite agree with the other panellists. The information has been out there.
Yeah.
I think for any political leader to stand up there and say, if you don't know, vote no, is an absolute slap in the face of the democratic right that we have here as Australians.
Yeah.
We're required to vote. It's then incumbent upon everyone to help us have the information.
Yeah. So we're going to actually go to a community leader, someone who has really been working with the community, Jill Gallagher, who's a Gunditj Mara woman and the CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Controlled Community Health Organisation, also known as VACCHO. So here's what she had to say to our reporter, Sophia Jane.
For many, many years, we as Aboriginal people and Aboriginal organisations, we've known that when health is in Aboriginal hands, we get better outcomes. And so having a voice to Parliament that can directly advise government and Parliament on solutions to some of the issues that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities suffer today. We know there's solutions. When you hear from the media, you hear, oh, the polls have turned. There's a, you know, the Yes campaign has taken a big dive. That's what you hear from the media. I don't hear that on the streets, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. I just think it's, you have your ups and downs. I'm hearing from Aboriginal communities that this is the right way to go. I'm hearing from the Aboriginal communities that we need this voice. There are some of our communities who don't support the voice, but there's a number of reasons for that. Mistrust of governments, that transgenerational trauma that you see very high in our communities, and I'm also hearing that, you know, there's a bit of hope back there in our thinking, you know. And I've always said, even through my own health journeys, hope is such a powerful medicine.
And we'll pick up on those thoughts from Jill Gallagher in a moment. We also spoke to Evan Mulholland, currently a Victorian Shadow Minister. As a member of the Liberal Party, he speaks essentially from the point of view of a Conservative no, but there's a range of perspectives even from the no position. Let's take a listen.
I'm someone who supports constitutional recognition. I'm actually someone that's very in favour of constitutional change as a long-time supporter of the Australian Republic. But I think the voice is a step too far. I think the voice is legally risky. And I come to that from the perspective that Australia, one of its great values is egalitarianism. Everyone being equal under the law. Australia is built on a foundation of equal civic rights, which means that regardless of your race, religion, creed, ethnicity, everyone has equal opportunity, and equal opportunity is what's important. And I think that the voice is the wrong model.
Yeah, so this is one perspective from the no side. There's a complex range of reasons people might vote no. That's just one view. Jill Gallagher has spoken about the role of a voice to Parliament will play in improving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's health outcomes. And so leading on from that, I'd like to talk about those kind of interesting aspects that we discussed in relation to polling. So it seems like from Jill Gallagher's perspective, there's a very different sentiment on the ground from what she's been seeing, and she's actively been campaigning for the yes vote. I'm wondering how you feel, and this question might be best answered by Charles and Grant, about that media representation of Indigenous communities as divided. Is it representative, or is it kind of a misrepresentation of the kind of conversations happening at that community level? Grant?
Look, once again, the voice is not the one-stop shop, and some of the stuff that Jill spoke about, that remains to be seen yet, whether the voice is going to actually do those sorts of things. I mean, the voice is about advising policy, how to better spend money that's already being spent on Aboriginal affairs, how to do things better. That's the whole idea why this comes about. It's not to add more money, as far as I know. It's to deal with the situation with unemployment, housing, education. So I think the expectations, as I said before, of the voice is going to solve all our problems. It's not. It's just going to be giving us a seat at the table to provide advice to government. That's all it is. It's not going to fix our problems. The sorts of problems that Jill's speaking about, health and housing, and that they get funded through government, and they need to work out better ways that they spend the money and get more value for the dollar, because these problems, as I mentioned before, have been around for decades now.
And Charles, as we mentioned before in your referendum tapes, you really canvassed a range of opinions from, really talking to individuals instead of a homogenous group. How do you feel about that kind of representation sometimes of Indigenous people as this divided community debating yes and no?
Oh, look, I think Reuben Berg puts it really quite brilliantly. Reuben's a Gurra Jamara man. He's the co-chair, one of the co-chairs of the First People's Assembly of Victoria. And he always says it so eloquently when he says we get 32 people, democratically elected Aboriginal people from across Victoria in the room to talk about the foundations for treaty. This has been going on for 4 years, as many of us know. And we don't always come in there with the same attitude and with the same strategy. But ultimately, we arrive at the same objective. We want the same outcome for our people, and we want the same outcome for Victoria. So it really frustrates me, I think, when people seek to divide us and they seek to exploit every single crack that appears in our armour. And for too long, this is what's happened within the Aboriginal community, that we've let ourselves be divided. But with leaders that we have, like Auntie Jill Gallagher, like Reuben Berg and so many others, we're hopeful that those cracks can no longer be exploited. But division, look, it happens in any community.
Yeah.
Let's just get past that.
Yeah. And I think there's been real leadership from people like Jill Gallagher and yourself in that kind of consulting with people and really listening to different views, but not expecting a consensus. We wouldn't expect that from anyone else, yeah.
Exactly.
We're going to have another short break, so do stay with us. We'll be back shortly.
And welcome back. So we're going to continue the conversation now, talking about the harm that the referendum campaign has caused to many First Nations people. From early on, it's been reported that the referendum debate has had a significant health impact on Indigenous Australians. We spoke to Jill Gallagher. We'll play a clip from her. Jill Gallagher, as we mentioned before, is the CEO of VACCHO. Here's what she had to say about the racism that's come up throughout the campaign.
Conversations have gotten a little bit hairy, haven't they? VACCHO ourselves have received some hate mail, which was personally addressed to me. And that's, you know, this scary stuff. I actually thought our nation had matured, this nation that we call Australia. I thought we'd matured well beyond some of the stuff that I'm hearing and seeing on social media. You know, it is scary, and it is not right, and it is racism.
Yeah, so Jill Gallagher makes some really interesting points there, Jill Gallagher, CEO of VATCHO, about social media's role, as well as this idea of maturity, which I found quite interesting. So what I wanted to ask is, do you think that social media has enabled or even generated a new kind of racism, or is it just revealing a racism that's never gone away, kind of picking up on what she said, that perhaps we haven't gotten as far as we thought? Grant, would you like to?
I think both of those things that has provided that platform just shows you how much more education is required in Australia, and all of a sudden people are talking about treaties like they never existed. You know, in this country we've been talking about a treaty for such a long time. We've been talking about constitutional reform for such a long time. So these aren't new notions that we've been talking about. You talk about the leaders that are currently around, but you know, our struggle's been built on elders like Sir Doug Nicholls, William Cooper, so many great people, Mundawi Yunupingu, Gallery Yunupingu, there's so many people that have come before us. All we're doing is carrying the baton forward, but this is nothing new to Indigenous people. We're fighting for our rights, we're fighting recognition, and have been since, you know, Europeans come here, BC, you know, Captain Cook, and you know, we're still fighting for that recognition till today. So, you know, the leaders are only carrying on the baton. I think that's important to note, you know, and we're not all going to agree on every specific issue as Indigenous people, but you know, at the end of the day, we'll still come to a consensus.
Yeah, and Charles, what about you? Have you, like Jill Gallagher, been surprised at all by the kind of racism and the harmful language, or has it kind of been what you expected?
I've known Auntie Jill for quite a number of years. When I was covering treaty and she was the Victorian Treaty Advancement Commissioner, we would have numerous conversations, and I was aware of numerous racist comments and threats that were thrown against her, and I'll guarantee she's really underselling what she's experienced. There's no doubt about it. On your topic of has social media enabled this, and paraphrasing your question, oh, absolutely. I've spoken to so many young people especially who tried to do the right thing in their minds, which is, I need to dispel a lot of these disinformation and subsequent misinformation that's appearing on social media. And it simply drives them into absolute fits of despair. My youngest daughter, Caitlin, ended up in a 3-day depression as a result of trying to deal with some particularly hateful comments that arose about an issue about this. Social media has a lot to answer for, but more importantly, we as users and consumers of social media have a lot to answer for. This has been a dirty campaign, no doubt about it, and social media is responsible or the culprit for much of the disinformation and angst that's out there in the community right now.
Yeah.
No doubt about it.
I'm going to bring in another voice here. We spoke to ABC's Indigenous Affairs editor, Bridget Brennan, last week, and she spoke to us about her experience, about what it's been like reporting on The Voice as a Djadjurrung and Yorta Yorta journalist. Here's what she had to say to us.
I often say it does feel like, even no matter where you are on the proposal, it can feel like our rights are being debated and our history is being debated. And that's quite difficult because we go to work every day. And as journalists, we have to absorb a hell of a lot of news and have a look at social media. And some of the stuff on social media has been quite nasty and quite racist. So that's the downside, I guess, being absorbed in a debate that's about you and your history and your family. It's not difficult to stay balanced for me because I'm really interested in hearing the views of all sorts of Indigenous people. And I think there is a huge range of diversity in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people all across the country. So I'm really interested to hear people's points of view. But the nastiness does get quite difficult at times, and it does take a toll.
Yeah, so that's Bridget Brennan reflecting on what she's also written about, calling it a bruising campaign for Indigenous people. Grant and Charles, you both work in Indigenous-led or Indigenous-owned media, and I'm wondering, is that a different kind of space to have these conversations? Have you at all felt protected from some of the kind of harmful language and able to hold a different kind of conversation? Grant?
Certainly not at 3KND. We get death threats all the time, and a lot of unhappy people ringing in and questioning stuff that we're talking about on air. So I don't think it's a safe place. I mean, it's quite unsettling, as Jill said, that, you know, this campaign, the referendum has brought out a lot of bigots, a lot of racist people, and one person said to me one time that, you know, the difference about today's world compared to the 40s, 50s, 30s, 60s is that there's laws against racism now, so people aren't inclined to verbalise stuff now, they just hold it within. But when this referendum came along, the social media stuff that you were talking about just exploded, where anything anti-Aboriginal, or this referendum was used as a platform to, you know, put out that poison out there and their bigotry and their racist views. So it's been quite confronting as an Indigenous person to think, after all these years that we're making, you know, progressive steps forward, and all of a sudden this campaign, and mainstream media's been responsible for a lot of this too, the papers. You know, Sky News, there's a lot of people out there that have spread a lot of untruths and taken us back to the dark ages. Just as we were moving forward, we've gone back decades now, and that's a real concern for me, and particularly our elders. They're vulnerable. They go out to places, we only represent 3% of the population. They all feel vulnerable when they go out after this referendum, particularly if it's a no vote, with all the stuff that's been talked about. A lot of them are feeling quite unsettled.
Thank you. And Charles, just quickly, have you had a similar experience working in your own Victorian Aboriginal news, or has it felt like a safer space away?
It's felt much safer, but I have a very different model to what's been experienced at 3KD. I also, just before I continue, and I know we're short on time, but I do want to pay my respect to the team at ABC. A lot of news teams have done amazing work, and Bridget, Dana Morse, and Borsha, I think at ABC, have done exceptional work in very, very tough situations. But as an Aboriginal journalist, it's actually been really good for me because I can get in where other people can't. So I do already have connections, I know Grant does too, with traditional owner groups around Victoria. That's a telling factor. That's where we can tell the different stories.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing those experiences with us. I feel very grateful to get to hear that from both of you. We're going to go to a break now. Stay with us. After the break, we'll be talking about what happens when the nation wakes up on Sunday and how journalists can constructively report on the outcome.
welcome back to our live panel at RMIT. I'm Ruth McHugh-Dillon. It's time for us to consider what happens after the referendum, whatever the result is. So there's been a lot of different stories that we've been told and that we've been telling as journalists about what will happen if the result is a yes and if it's a no. And our closest neighbours in New Zealand, Aotearoa, have already been through something similar a few decades ago. So we're going to go to a live explainer before we open up this kind of international comparison to the panel. So Annabelle Fleming and Sydney Lang let us know a little bit about what other models for constitution exist in the world.
Thanks, Ruth and Maddie. When making claims about what the voice to Parliament would achieve in Australia, campaigners on both sides of the debate have made references to what's happened overseas.
There's been claims in the media that voice equivalents abroad have escalated in power and caused division. One case study frequently cited is our friends over the ditch. The New Zealand Indigenous Voice
Tribunal has veto power over legislation in New Zealand.
And we came across some alarming developments. New Zealand has become deeply divided by race.
The New Zealand Indigenous Voice to Parliament, the Waitangi Tribunal, was established in 1975. The permanent advisory body was tasked with considering claims by Māori against the Crown regarding breaches of the treaty. Te Tiriti or Waitangi, the treaty signed in 1840, is New Zealand's founding document. It was intended to create a partnership between Māori and the Crown, but governments since have violated the conditions. So the Waitangi Tribunal functions to investigate these breaches. The tribunal has no veto or legislative power, and its legal role has not changed in the 50 years since its creation.
Further away, in Norway, the Indigenous Sami people have had a voice in Parliament for over 30 years. Side by side, the role of the Sami Parliament seems to be one of the closest comparable bodies to the voice proposal in Australia. In 1987, after years of protest from the Indigenous people of Norway, the Sami Parliament was established. Consisting of 39 elected representatives, the Parliament is not technically a parliament, but instead works as an advisory body, consulting the Norwegian government on matters impacting Sami. The group acts as a voice for the Sami and their interests, including language, land, and culture preservation.
And whilst the history of both these advisory groups is complex and their success is mixed, neither have developed a veto power as is being feared. Both have achieved greater representation for their Indigenous peoples.
But Australia's history is unique, and the goals and therefore outcomes of a voice here won't necessarily be the same as abroad. That's all from us. Back to you, Maddie and Ruth.
Thanks, Annabelle and Sydney. That was a really informative explainer. So I'd like to bring to the panel, is there something we can learn from these parallels, or is that a useful tool in the media to report on these international precedents, and how have they been used in the campaign? Maybe I'll go to Grant.
Look, I think it's reflective of Australia that the only Commonwealth country that don't have a treaty. Every other Commonwealth country does. That says a lot. The treaties in New Zealand have been broken. They've been broken in Canada. So that doesn't give you a lot of confidence, does it? And the voice, it's just a mechanism to talk to government. I mean, government don't have to act upon anything, and it's been shown that that's the case in New Zealand.
I might bring Idwin in here. Have you come across any, have you done any fact checking in terms of people, I suppose, you know, there's been narratives that the voice is something that hasn't been done before or something like that, but then I suppose there are these international precedents as was explained to us before. Has anything like that come up in your fact checking? Or?
Yeah, we've definitely seen it as a narrative. We definitely saw the comparison between New Zealand and Australia. Again, there was a deep lack of understanding of what the voice was, because to a lot of the people who were spreading misinformation, you know, they believed that the voice had veto power and would be a third chamber of parliament, that was another one, or would give special rights or special constitutional rights. So unfortunately, when a lot of those comparisons were drawn, a lot of the people were already thinking it was a lot more powerful or it was a different model. And so it wasn't very good for public explanation of what the policy was. I think what was much better, and my panellists have both said it, is going back to what the proposal was. Yeah. So I think, this is obviously observational, in my opinion, but I think it was a bit of a red herring at times and a bit confusing at times, just in the way people interpreted other models and brought it back to Australia. It was like, each context is so different.
Absolutely. Charles, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Ivan has absolutely knocked it on the head there. Absolutely brilliant. This is a very different ask, and we need to bring it back to the 92 words of the proposed amendment. It's that simple. Even Pearson, one of the architects, has said it's a very, very small ask, much less than what we've seen overseas. So I don't really see that it can be comparable.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's really interesting. Noel Pearson is one of the prominent campaigners for the Yes side who's spoken at the National Press Club. And that's been another interesting forum to kind of air the main arguments, yes and no. And we're very interested in it as journalists. What is the role of the National Press Club? But I'd like to throw this to the panel. We're going to see, a short grab. But basically, one of the criticisms has been that it's given a platform to yes and no people and Indigenous spokespeople for yes and no, and that has somewhat skewed the idea that it's an evenly balanced number, whereas we've been talking about that 80% number of people in favour. So we're just going to do a quick summary now of the key no Indigenous spokespeople at the National Press Club, and then I'd like to talk about how much that's kind of framed the debate, the way we talk about it.
In your speech, you claimed some Indigenous organisations, quote, want to demonise colonial settlement. Could I ask you, please, do you believe the history of colonisation continues to have an impact on some Indigenous Australians?
No.
The Yes campaign is out there every day accusing the No campaign of lying. But the Yes campaign is built on a pack of lies.
This country, your system of government, has been built on lies. Lies. And the referendum for the voice to Parliament is a continuation of these lies.
The referendum will be a choice between two opposing visions for Indigenous Australians. One is a vision of segregation, bureaucratic control and dependency, and a mindset focused on historical grievance and identity politics. The other is a vision of economic participation, financial independence and self-determination, and a mindset focused on jobs, education, social stability and practical initiatives.
The truth is, for all the moral posturing and virtue signalling about truth-telling, there is no genuine appetite in Canberra to tell the truth or to hear the truth. This could not be any clearer than in this government's referendum on the voice. Australians desperately want to do the right thing for their fellow Australians regardless of background.
The Black Sovereign Movement has been consistent to the opposition of any form of constitutional recognition and this voice to Parliament. This is just another attempt by a colonial government to make clear that it has power over us and force its rules upon us.
So we've heard here some of the key no campaigners, both the progressive no and a more conservative no at the National Press Club. So I'm interested in hearing from you what you think about kind of the way that these appearances have really led the headlines and kind of pushed the conversation publicly. Is the National Press Club and these kind of appearances the most relevant way to know what's going on in the Indigenous community? Charles?
I think the National Press Club has really done quite a sterling job. It has given some of the great journalists, some of the more responsible journalists, the opportunity to actually force these people, whether on the yes or the no camp, to respond to questions. Now, for example, when Warren Mundine spoke, and I watched that presentation, and when Jacinta Price spoke, both times I saw John Paul Janke from NITV's The Point get up there and request pointedly, will you please, Jacinta, come onto the program, and actually ask Warren Mundine, would you please influence Jacinta to come onto the program? I'm aware that they've asked her 12 times to come on there. These sorts of forums are important. We've seen some very responsible journalism at the Press Club. The balance of how many yes campaigners and how many no campaigners are there, I don't think is truly indicative of, if we're looking at an 80-20 split in the Aboriginal people, that's been appropriate. But they are the prominent speakers. It does give highlight to their messages, and it's the media's responsibility to report everything, as much detail. I'm a supporter of what they've done there, and they've done some great interviews there.
Thank you. And Grant, do you agree, or?
Oh, strongly disagree. I don't think there's two more Indigenous people disliked more than Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price. I think it's poignant that Jacinta Price's tribe came out and said that they didn't support her. She's not a leader and they don't agree with what she says. Mundine's been a leader of the Labor, he's been in the Labor Party, he's been in the Liberal Party, he's done the round, so he's just going where it best suits him.
So do you think they shouldn't have been given a platform?
Certainly not. Certainly not. And they're not speaking on behalf of Aboriginal people, they're speaking on behalf of their political parties that they represent, which is really important. Jacinta Price's father was a priest, a man of the cloth, so obviously a lot of her ideologies and conditionings come from her father. To say that colonisation hasn't affected Aboriginal people is just ludicrous. Can't believe that someone so stupid would say something like that. That's still affecting Aboriginal people. There's traumas, generational trauma that's gone through for a long time and it still exists right now. I think putting Lydia Thorpe into that category as Mundine and Price is not quite correct. Lydia Thorpe is about constitutional recognition. That's what she wants, quite separate from what Mundine and Price are talking about. I think Lydia Thorpe's got some really valid points and she's going straight to the throat, basically, so to speak. She's not mucking around with the voice. She wants to get straight and sort it out. And some of the stuff that Lydia says is quite accurate. And she's come from a long line of Indigenous political activists in her family and the community that she's grown up with. And what Lydia is talking about is more in line with what the treaty is going to reflect as we go forward. Treaties are happening in Victoria. I don't think too many people are aware about treaties like they're not aware about the referendum. And after the referendum campaign's finished, people will start to focus on the treaty and stuff like that and try and tear that apart as well.
And that's exactly what we're going to come to. What happens after the referendum and how can we constructively report on it as journalists? So please join us after the break.
You're back with us live from RMIT University with a Referendum Eve special. My name's Maddie Lowe-Booth and we're here with my co-host Ruth McHugh-Dillon, and we're also joined by a fantastic live panel, Grant Hansen, Charles Bacana and Edwin Jeffrey. Thanks so much for being here. We're going to be looking ahead, thinking about what kinds of stories will be constructive when the nation wakes up on Sunday after the results have been announced. This is regardless of whether the outcome is a yes or no. We're going to move to a question from the audience now. Tito, are you there?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you. I teach journalism at RMIT, and so I get to really, work with a lot of young, new journalists. And I also study journalism, especially in journalism around The Voice. But I think I've been increasingly thinking that it's not just about teaching people how to do good journalism as we think of good journalism looks like right now. Maybe we need to also think more deeply about how do we move forward to create journalism that actually can capture the complexity of what Australia looks like right now, and also the complexity of social media and the way people talk about, or the complexity of racism. It seems like mainstream journalism has basically failed in capturing a lot of this stuff. So how do we move forward from here?
You've got to start reporting the truth. It's all about the truth. If you're going to make reports on anything, you report the truth. And, we've seen successive governments, probably since John Howard going forward, that there's a lot of mistruths that people take it as being the truth, and it's not. And a lot of people don't have any confidence in journalists or the mainstream media anymore because they're cited by either the people that are paying them, through sponsorship, through monies, all that type of stuff. So people don't have the confidence about any news that they read now, whether it's on social media or the daily editorials, to be actually factual. People confused about what's true and what's not.
Charles, do you have anything to add to that?
I think, I do, thank you. And really great question, because as journalists, we have a huge role to play in what has happened over these months. It's not the Voice that's divisive, it's the campaign that's become really divisive. And the media has, unfortunately, or elements of the media have played into this. There have been some great people within the media and great teams within the media, the ABC, The Guardian, NITV, SBS. I think those three in particular, those are the sources I've gone to. They've done a great role. But if we would really to sit down and look at what journalism is like in this country and where we need to go back to old school. We need to go back to journalists who actually were out there in communities, meeting with the people about whom they were writing. My father, as the industrial correspondent with the Sydney Morning Herald, would go out drinking with Bob Hawke, which I believe was a pretty tough thing. Okay? And this is what we need to do. I get out there in community. I know Grant gets out there in community. We need to teach journalists not to sit on their bums in an office and make a phone call, do an interview, and that's the story. Get out there, don't reach for the sensational headline, tell the story, tell the truth. That's it. And until we get back to that with journalism, then this country has got a lot of problems in front of it.
I think that it's such a great point, and also, I suppose, speaks to kind of the culture within journalism as well, and perhaps the way that the working environment is structured in terms of what kind of jobs there are in it, how many people are casualised. Those are also parts of the conversation too, perhaps. I really want to bring Edwin into this as well. I suppose you've somewhat recently graduated, you've worked in journalism for a bit, and you're tackling Indigenous issues through your work as a fact checker. I'm just wondering if there was anything during your education that you wish had come up sooner that would prepare you for that.
Well, first off, I just want to echo the points these guys have made, which is connection to community is so important. I don't think journalists know how to talk to communities in a way that they understand and in the spaces that they understand. I think we're still figuring that out. During my course, I think it would have been great to have more pushing of explanatory journalism. I think, journalists, we are out here to inform, especially around a democratic event. And so a little less emphasis on hard news, commentary, feature news, which we've seen a lot of, and I don't know about anyone else, but I've been exhausted with the inundation of voice-related content that I've had to wade through. But it hasn't been a lot of this is what it is. It's been a lot of covering it from every single angle that we can possibly think of, and sound bites and gladiatorialism and polarization. And so I think just really bringing it back to saying what it is, informing the voter.
That goes really well, thank you, Edwin, to a conversation we had with Bridget Brennan, so the ABC Indigenous Affairs editor, about advice she had for reporting on Indigenous issues, which I think comes back to a lot of those core things that you're talking about, good journalism. So we'll see what she has to say.
Do your history on the mob that you're going to talk to, you know, understand where they come from, what their history is, what the impact of colonisation has been on that mob, you know, really understand where they're coming from. I think if you can do that before you go out and talk to people. And then the same principles apply, I think, for Indigenous journalism as they do for any kind of piece of journalism that you're doing, getting your facts right, making sure you give people time to comment, making sure you're thinking about a range of different views. You know, I think traditionally Indigenous affairs reporting has had this assumption that, oh, well, this Indigenous community is saying this, and we've got 2 or 3 speakers here, and maybe we haven't necessarily gone to do the work to find that there might be, you know, different views in a community. So that's changing a little bit, but I think we could still do better in that regard.
So we've come to the end of our show. We're hoping that everybody here in the audience feels a bit more informed and is excited to head to the polls tomorrow. Please join us in thanking our wonderful panel tonight, Charles Pakana, Grant Hansen and Edwin Jeffrey. And of course, a big thank you to everyone in the live audience today. Thanks for coming down on this. I don't even know what the weather's like in the afternoon. I've been inside all day. But thank you very much for being here this afternoon and joining us. And that's the end of our show. Thanks very much. Have a good night, everyone.